morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Sherry Shish with Powered by Quilting, and this is month 6 of the love letter block of the month. This month we are going to be making the last block that we have in this quilt. I'm going to open this up real quick. And it's the block for this kind of row here. It's a wave or a snail block. Pretty much you are using background and fabric K for this block. It's right here. Okay, I kind of have this little setup set on the cutting mat for the blocks that we already have. So a couple things to note. You are going to be using pages 13 and 14 of the pattern, and this block, there's a couple tips that I would say. Number 1, measure, measure, measure. Number 2, when you are cutting out your squares, make sure you know which ones are half square triangles and which ones are quarter square triangles. And as a pro tip, the largest square that you're cutting is going to be quarter square triangles, which means you're going to cut diagonal to diagonal. That actually becomes the second size triangle. And then you have a smaller square that becomes this one and a larger square that becomes this one. This is actually going to be larger than the larger square that you end up with. I know it's confusing. Part of it is because you're cutting it in half versus cutting it in quarters. One of the things I will also tell you is when you're cutting your squares, do not move your piece before you cut your diagonals. That will keep your squares from skewing and getting a little goofy. So cut with the fabric, cut your squares, and then before you reposition, take your square and cut either your diagonal or your double diagonal. Got it? All right, because this block, there's no pre-sewing that I did, so there's no step-ups. We're going to make this block completely from start to finish once you have all your pieces cut out. Okay, and it starts from the center. We are going to be making a 4-patch of the block. So we will have 2 of the print pieces and 2 of the background pieces like so. And we are going to sew these together. Again, these are also a little bit wonky of measurements. I rounded to the nearest 1/8 inch measurement, so make sure you are cutting your pieces appropriately with your ruler and that they are square. The other thing to check is to make sure that your 1/4 inch seams are accurate when you're going along. I have given you general measurements. Some of them are more accurate than others, and I will point that out. Some of them are on a diagonal because they're the center of the block is now on point. So those are relative. They should measure here. If you're off slightly, trust the process and keep going. If you know you're accurate on your seams, keep going and then measure and trim the final block, okay? So in this case, when we're just doing a 4-patch, I'm gonna web piece this together where I'm gonna sew the top row and the bottom row, press my seams, and then sew the diagonal, but without cutting this apart, okay? That. The other thing I will mention, once we start sewing with our triangles, do not push or pull your fabric through the machine. We are going to be working with biased edges in this case, and they will stretch. We're going to press our seams to the print fabric or fabric K in this sense. Okay. So we have 2 things like that. Fold them together, and then I'm going to sew this to make it a 4-patch. On the back of, I guess it's page 14. It's really the back of month 6, but it's printed front and back, right? On page 14, I do have a tip on how you want to align your triangles. I will walk through that here as well when you're making this block. If you're like, hey Sherry, this block looks really familiar to another block that you did in a different quilt, you're probably right. This block is very similar to some of those that we did in Wave Pool in that block of the month. So now that we have our center, all right, a couple things that you'll want to remember. I swirl to the right You can theoretically swirl the other way if you want. It really doesn't matter. It's just the way that I do it. If you do the swirl the other way, the instructions are not going to follow correctly. And what you'll want to make sure to do is that your blocks, you want to make all of them identical swirl, or else this little wave pattern that you're going to get when you put them side by side isn't going to work. Okay. So I have my block here. We're going to take our next set of triangles, which is the smallest set of triangles, and I'm going to start with a print fabric. They will never go side by side. They will always go opposite directions. And what you're going to want to do is make sure your point of your triangle sits in that center column, okay? And then you're going to do your raw edges this way. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side and sew down the other side. Okay. So, again, these are all 1/4 inch seams, nothing smaller or larger. And because the other side, I need to find that center, I'm going to open this up like so and put my other triangle on the opposite side to be able to find that corner. Sew down. So you should have something that looks like this. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to use my iron and press these triangles open. All right. Okay. Now that I have this, the next step is I'm going to take my background triangles. I'm going to take 2 of those and we're going to fill in the other side. Same thing like we did before. We're going to align our raw edges, but then center our point of our triangle to that center line that we already have because it's a 4-patch. So theoretically, I could have had a solid piece in here, but then you'd have to make your folds to find your center lines of your block. Okay, so like so, we're going to sew down and then we're going to flip it and do it on the other side. I find it easier to press all of my seams out, like just in one direction. You can press your seams open to get your block to stay a little bit more flat. It is completely up to you on how you want to handle this. Most of this pattern for Love Letter, you can do either one. It is your personal tolerance whether or not you want to deal with clashing seams at the end of the quilt. I personally will live with it, but I know several folks that really dislike it and will do anything they can not to have those. Okay. So again, iron, and I'm pressing my seams open. A couple other things, just as a rule of thumb, you don't need to do this, but I like cutting out my dog ears here because honestly, you don't need to have them. So I'm just going to cut my extra dog ears. I use scissors because, you know, why not? All right, so now we're going to add our next piece, okay? And we're going to take now our second triangle, the second size, right? Again, these were the largest squares that we did into 1/4 square triangles, like so, okay? And we're doing the swirl, right? We're doing the same swirl. Now, in this case, it is a little weird because what you'll want to do, either you want to fold your pieces and find your lines, or you can take a ruler and then slightly mark it with a Frixion pen if you would like, or some erasable pen to say, yep, I want to do diagonal to diagonal and say, yep, here's that line here and here. And you'll want to do it on both sides. I'm not going to do both sides because we're not ironing this, right? So for this first one, I'm going to align it here with my raw edges and say, yep, I'm pointing towards that center line. I probably should have done that a little bit closer. So where my seam points here and here, I'm essentially connecting cross, 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 and then in the center here to make it a little bit like, yep, I know what I'm shooting for. I'm gonna do my lines like that. And then the next time I'm going to flip it over and do my line here. I personally do not measure my blocks until the end because I find it a little bit easier to just trust the process than to feel as if my block is completely wonkadoodle in this space to begin with. But we're going to continue on. So your piece should look like this now, and because I used a Frixion pen or a heat erasable pen, that mark when I finish will no longer be there. Okay. And then we are now going to add our white background pieces on this side. And again, you can use a pen to go where intersection, intersection, intersection. You don't need the full line across, you just kind of need it in the middle where you are going to be doing your pieces, just to give yourselves a little bit of like, yep, I am aligned. So raw edges align here. My piece goes towards that line middle. Sew that down, and I'm going to do that on the other side as well. So this snail has what I consider 3 different layers, right? So we did the 4-patch, and we have our first layer of triangles. We're working on our second layer of triangles. And then after this, we will have what I'm going to call our third layer of triangles. And then we'll be finished. So you should have a square that looks like this. I'm going to go ahead and iron my piece now. And I'm going to do the same thing like I did with the first layer and just, cut off my dog ears. Again, it doesn't hurt you to keep the dog ears there, honestly. It just means you'll have that seam or the dog ears inside your seam allowance. It really, really doesn't matter. It's personal preference. I just like to get rid of them. And I get rid of them by scissors. I don't even use one of the rotary cutters. All right, so now we have our block, and we're going to be adding our last layer now. In our last layer, we're now back square with our center pieces. We're going to take our largest triangles now, and we are going to go a line here with that point in the middle, and now we're going to sew across. Take 2 of those. Okay. Make sure your point is aligned with that center section, like so. Raw edges all aligned. Okay. Rotate 180, open it back up, and we're going to sew on the other side, aligning the point with the center of the block to make sure our triangle is centered. And now this is our block so far. Same thing, we're going to press our seams and open them up. And now we're going to add the last background pieces. So 2 triangles from the background piece, aligning with the center of the block, aligning with the raw edges like so. And we're going to do that on both sides. This block is probably the trickiest block. However, it's more forgiving than what most people think. A lot of folks think that this block is not very forgiving at all. I find it pretty forgiving at the end of the day. You just want to make sure that you have your seams sewn, you know, generally in the right spot, with your points in the right spot of, you know, orientation. If you are completely wonky on your points, then your block does get really far off. But you want to make sure that you have all of those there. We have this block like so, and we're going to press this now. It's really only at this point do I personally measure my block, okay? And I take my ruler and I will go through. I'm going to actually scoot all of this up so I have some space. To have from my big ruler. Take a ruler that's bigger than what we're looking for, and looking at, okay, can I get all of my pieces in the right spot? So you should be pretty darn perfect on your block. If you look at this, like my pieces are pretty darn perfect. There's a little bit here and there where it's a little wonky. I'm going to go and center my block as best as I can, and where my piece kind of intersects, that should be a 1/4 inch away, right? That should be your seam allowance. And so what I do now is I'm going to go ahead and trim up just a hair, which should just be our dog ears, right? So if you're looking at this, I'm not trimming a ton on this block at all. And then I'm going to rotate this 180 to then be able to go and do the other side. Okay, like so. Alright. I'm actually double check that because I think that one got a little wonky on my end. Okay. Yeah, that did not cut. I was like, when I measured that, that didn't work right. There we go. And now that your block is all trimmed up, you have it 100% complete. You're going to make multiples of these blocks, and then you're going to sew them rotated from each other. Now, if your blocks are just slightly off, trim them up the best you can when you sew them all together. Even if you're slightly off on this rotation, you're not going to know. You really aren't. So that is it for month 6. What we're going to do is the full quilt top assembly on October 14th. What I haven't quite figured out yet is there any pre-work? Because I kind of don't want the entire stream on October 14th just sewing block after block after block to make rows and then sew all the rows together. I want to make sure that it is a good use of your time if you're coming back to watch this video and not watching me live. So either way, I will see you on October 14th at noon right here to do the full quilt top assembly. At a minimum, if you want to sew along, I will be giving clips or tips about each of the rows and how to sew them together and how do you do that alignment. And then, I don't know, I might have some stuff pre-done. If you watch me on Twitch, you'll be able to see more of that real-time sewing than YouTube. I try to make sure this live is the most efficient use of your time. All right, well, I hope everyone has a great month, and I hope you love the blocks so far, because we are pretty much done with each of the block assemblies. Now, make this more times, and we'll finish out the row. That's it for this month. I'll see you October 14th. Thank you.